Hi, good morning, everyone. I know, depending on the time frame and time zone that you're in, it's good afternoon, and in some cases, even good evening. So thanks for joining the session today. As I mentioned earlier, we are looking at reading into this particular unit, which is Strategic Human Resource Management. And on my screen, I've got documents open. One of them is the unit specification that I'm going to be using to obviously teach and deliver this unit. So there are 5 learning outcomes in this particular unit, and when we look at this today, our focus is to look at covering just the first learning outcome, which is going to be giving us some idea and some insights into understanding this whole field of human resource management. Now, the unit aim in particular is to understand and develop some sort of an understanding in terms of how resources, but in particular human resources, are managed within the organization. Because we have different types of resources. We look at physical resources, administrative resources, financial resources. You also look at now human, or the manpower is one of the resource. And this is also a very critical function in the modern day organizations. So the unit and the content that we're going to study in this unit is going to be focused on understanding how this particular resource is going to be effectively utilized within an organization. So what does the CEO expect? What does the management expect from HR? Those kind of things is what we are going to be focused on learning, and also picking up some of the tools, techniques, models, frameworks which have been created and researched over the years, and how is the modern face of HR. Somebody who says that I work in the HR department, or when I say that I'm one of my key roles is to manage people, and that is what we want to understand in terms of what do those people do, how do they manage resources, like especially human resources, and how do they get these human resources, or people, manpower, employees, staff, whichever way we call them, to get them to achieve the organizational objectives which are set. So here we are going to be also at a later stage in the latter half of the unit, when we study learning outcome 4 and 5, we'll also be looking at evaluating the contribution of HRM as a department within the organization. So when we look at departments, we talk about different departments and roles within the organization where people work. So you could be working in sales, marketing, administration, finance, engineering, production, manufacturing. Depends on the type of organization you work in, whether it's an organization producing goods or it's an organization producing services, or both goods and services. So the idea would be to also evaluate at some stage the contribution of this particular department. People who work within HR look after things like planning, recruitment, selection, appraisals, looking at policies, unions, things like that. The idea would be to understand what is their contribution to the overall organizational strategy. And last but not the least, what we are going to be also looking at is understanding the role of leadership in HR. So why do we now also have a category called Chief HR Officer? So when we look at the traditional organizations of the 80s, 90s, the early 2000s, we used to see CXO type of management people, generally being the Chief Financial Officer, Chief, say for example, Executive Officer, Operations Officer. But over the years, this has also got expanded to HR, and what we do see is that HR makes a very valuable contribution in providing overall workability of the strategy within the organization, and that is why sometimes we see a chief HR officer, depending on the size of the organization, being also present. So the main role of the level HR officer is to align the overall organizational strategy with the HR strategy, and the HR strategy then, with the help of resources, actually delivers the goals and objectives which the organization needs to achieve. So simple goals and objectives, profitability, turnover, those kind of things, because they are the ones which keep the employees motivated, look at lots of other things that we will also discuss in the unit. So that is what we are looking at covering, in this particular unit. But in the first learning outcome, we are going to be essentially focused on understanding the role of strategic human resources management. What is HR? Why is it become strategic now in the 21st century? We want to look at some of the core history and models of how the function has evolved over the years. And last but not the least, how does this work with other functional areas within the organization? So that is the concentration of, understanding. And this particular session will be focused on, building a bit of foundation and background in terms of what the HR essentially does, how it came about, and then how does it work in tandem with some of the other, departments within the organization. Is that okay? Okay, let's start. Now, first things first, what I want to be able to do is essentially look at understanding how do we look at, the definition of HR. So when we look at, in general, talking about, the definition of HR, what we will generally see is that we need to break this down and break it down into, 2 or 3 different aspects. So when we say strategic, that is one word. When we talk about HRM, that is another word. But within HR, we can actually divide that word into human resource and management. So let's look at the definition of these 3 words separately to understand, how they work together. So when we talk about strategy, what do we mean by strategy? Any ideas in terms of how do we define strategy, or what do we mean by strategy? Okay, it's maybe too early in the morning. Yeah, any ideas on strategy?
Yeah. Strategy is a plan. It's something that you come up with that you can make a thing go smoothly. It's basically a plan that you're working on so that you can support something.
That's correct. So exactly, that is correct. So basically, when we look at the word strategy, it comes across from a background in terms of military. It basically was used in that context earlier, and it meant that you need to be able to plan and organize things to be able to achieve an objective. So when we look at strategy in general, the word, it basically would mean that you need to plan certain things to be able to achieve a goal or an objective. And when we use the word strategy, it always emphasizes long term. So you can, when I say long term, that can also be a subjective definition. For some companies, businesses, organization, long term could be 3 months. When you're looking at a startup company, a venture capitalist company, you would look at probably, long term being 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Short term could be a month, a couple of weeks. So when you talk about strategy, it is primarily the action or the plan that you draw, and that is drawn up to achieve something, as an objective for the long term. But generally looking at, it has to be long term because of the fact that you're using the word strategic, and there's a lot of planning which goes about creating that plan, and sometimes plans take time to be delivered. Now, when we look at resources, I've just put some emphasis on resources earlier. So there are different types of resources, but as we understand globalization and as we understand that a lot of resources are now finite. So when we look at resources on the physical resources, administrative, financial equipment, other things, what we do see is human resources, or when we say resource, humans or people are also a resource within the organization. So without people, you cannot accomplish the goals and objectives which are set. And the reason why is that when you look at some of the other resources that I've named, you would generally see that you require humans to basically operate and utilize the other resources. So if you have a machinery, or if you have, say, for example, physical resources, you at some stage need humans to be able to utilize or work on those resources. So human resource is now actually considered in the 21st century the most important resource. And I think you would have come across this particular term a couple of times when you work within organizations, is that, and sometimes managers end up making this comment saying, I'm not able to find the right fit for the role. I'm not able to find the right person to be able to take up this role. And the reason why that statement is coming across is generally seen as that you do not have people with the right skill set or experience or background to be able to take up that role. So humans, when I say human, I mean people are also one of the most important resources today apart from financial equipment, administrative, physical resources when you're, getting on with work within the organization. Now, what does the word management mean? So what do you think the word management means? So management, when we use the word manager or management, it gives you a bit of a clue saying that, you're trying to manage things. You're trying to basically put together things which can be managed in a way wherein it produces a meaningful output. You are able to control certain things. So when we look at the nature of management, when we look at the role of management in general, if we just look at this word standalone, what you will generally see that management is the function which looks at planning, organizing, and also leading in some cases the organization. So when we talk about strategic, we talk about long-term planning. When we talk about resources, staffing, employees are one of the resources which work within the organization, which control some of the other resources, have the ability to be able to work on some of the other resources and get the desired output. But management is the function which allows this to be controlled as a whole. So what it tries to do is put a planning in place. Once the planning has been done, organizes everything to ensure that the whole organization is moving in that direction. And at some stage, they're controlling, directing the actions of the people and employees within the organization to get the desired output. So when we look at strategic HRM, it's a complex combination of three different words, and we need to understand the weightage of these three different words which actually make up this field. So when we talk about HRM in the early 1990s, it was called the human resource management. But when we talk about today, we also use the word human resources development. We also talk about strategic HRM. So there are different connotations of how these meanings are used when we study this subject. So depending on the organization, the function, and the kind of products or goods and services the organization is producing, the HR function would adapt to basically that particular definition. Now, if we focus on just the definition of this word, strategic HRM, and we put this together in terms of now understanding, after knowing the meanings of three different words, strategic HRM would be defined as a function within the organization which actually supports the achievement of long-term business goals. So if I take an example of a organization, most companies which are set up with one goal in mind, which is obviously an overarching goal that the company needs to make profits. The company needs to grow in terms of the market share, in terms of its turnover. So when we look at the goals, what we look at is that this particular function within the organization is keenly working on orienting the alignment of these business goals with the job description of individuals who work within the organization. So how does a sales manager or a business development manager or a business development director actually work and function? What are the priorities? So at different levels of the roles and responsibilities of the people within the organization, this function actually looks at strategically aligning the goals with the responsibility which the individual has, or the nature of work the individual does in terms of performing day-to-day responsibilities within the organization. The alignment of that is actually done by HR. Now, at some stage, if you imagine that you work within a company, at some stage you also look at that at the end of the year there are appraisals which happen, because at the end of the year the company sees whether they've achieved the goals, or have they met the targets. And at some stage this department, again, the person who wears the hat of being an HR manager again comes into play, and there the role is to evaluate and reward the performance of the individuals who have helped the company achieve the objectives. So if we look at the role of HR, the role of HR starts with the organization, and towards the end, when the organization completes a financial year or goes through a particular year of performance, their role will also be looking at evaluating how the individuals have performed by looking at conducting performance appraisals. And then if the performance has been satisfactory, has been over and above what was set, then there are rewards and other types of strategies put in place. So when we look at the concept of strategic HRM, that is something which has started to evolve in the early 1990s, and the distinction was being made between managing usual functions within the organization and how to strategically manage functions, wherein performance management was built in to say, okay, if you are able to achieve this, you get that. If you're able to achieve this set target, which are more of strategic targets in the market for the organization, then the emoluments and the rewards which the individual or the organization doles out to the individuals was much higher. So an example that I would give you here, just as a very literal example, would be that when you look at long-term goals which are set by the board or the senior management within the organization, you generally see that the top management would carry goals of increasing market share, increasing customer, say for example, experience, or bettering the customer experience and service. They would look at profitability, and with those goals, they look at getting, if they achieve those goals, they would look at getting some sort of rewards. So most of the top management gets shares, for example, which can be divested in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years time. So they get employee stock option plans, which is more in some cases, and in some cases commensurate to the salary packages which the person get at that level. At the middle management level, people would be generally getting bonuses or some sort of incentives, and at the junior level, the people would be getting incentives which are more in the form of rewards. For example, holiday trips, additional, say for example, perks, and generally the whole organization would see some sort of an uplift in terms of wages. So, for example, if the organization has achieved the goals, they have met the targets, there will be an overall increase in the salary of 2%, 3%, 5%, 10%, depending on what has been the individual contribution in the achievement of those goals. So when we look at the strategic nature of HRM, that started to come into play in the early 1990s, when there was a basic distinction which was being made between how people work on a day-to-day basis and perform some of the roles, and how some of the people who are outperforming the objectives given or the targets set would then be rewarded, commensurate to the achievements that they are bringing to the organization. And at that stage, we see the initial beginnings of how strategic HRM started to play an increasing role in the overall strategy of the organization. So when I say overall strategy, I mean the business strategy. So here, what we generally see would be that at some stage, people who were actually contributing more to the business in terms of their performance were then also being managed in terms of, say, for example, higher opportunities within the organization, things like promotion that we are aware of, getting more role or higher responsibility within the organization, and in some cases, additional perks and the responsibility of running operations for a strategic business unit or a department. And those are the things which turned the function into what we see as strategic HRM today. Now, it is important for us to also relate, because when we use, and in this unit, when we overuse the word strategy, it is important for us to link the word strategy with business strategy and how does it play into the overall HR plan. So I would not call it a strategy, but I would say an HR plan, which then enacts out the business strategy or the core strategy which is set by the management to achieve a particular objective within the organization. So when we talk about this, what we want to do is also look at stitching in the context of why business strategy and HR strategy have to be aligned for the organization to achieve the overall objectives. So when we look at describing the overall essence of what an organization stands for, what is the basic mission and vision of the organization, we need to have that deep rooted into the HR document. So when I say this, what I mean by that is that most of you work within an organization, either run business or work within an organization. What happens when you join a company? If you are new to a company and you join, what happens? Can you visualize that process of that you've applied for a job, but after the job interview selection, you've joined the company. Can you visualize what tends to happen in the first few days when you've joined the company? Any ideas in terms of when you join a company for the first time, you're as a new employee, what happens, what process you go through, what are the few activities do you do in the first few days of joining the organization?
There's usually induction that they take place, and they tell you about how the business runs, I suppose.
That's perfect. Yes, that's one of the key activities that you are put through, which is that you will go through some sort of an induction process in the organization to make you aware of processes, policies, your job description, some of the key standards which the organization would expect you to maintain, and in general, what you get hold of in the induction process, maybe some sort of an employee handbook. And that handbook basically gives you all the standards, procedures, quality manual, and basic things which the organization expects you to govern or basically run with when you're working within your role. So it will have things like how to apply for leave, when the appraisals will happen, basic structure of the organization, what are the procedures. You have a grievance, you want to make a complaint, dress code, rules and regulation, what discipline is expected, how you outwardly portray the image of the organization. Lots of do's and don'ts, policies and procedures are all part and parcel of that employee handbook. So one of the key process that you go through is the process of induction. And why is that process of induction done with a new employee within the organization? Is to ensure that you are going to follow some rules and regulations. And when you do your day-to-day responsibilities, you're going to be using that employee handbook or the information given in the employee handbook as a model of operational activities that you do to contribute towards the goals and objectives of the organization. What are the other things that you go through apart from this? You've joined the organization, you had a bit of an induction, now you've got onto your role, and a couple of months down the line, can you visualize some of the other activities which happen when you're working within the company?
You're on a probation, a training process and probation for the first 3 to 5 months.
That is absolutely correct. So that's spot on. The second part that you would normally go through is that most organizations today would have some sort of a trial period or a probationary period. And that would mean that if you have joined a new company, you have 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months probationary period. And what that would mean is that the organization is going to at some stage do an initial review to see if you are working within that planned document, you're able to set within your job role, and you're able to understand the roles and responsibilities which have been given, and then execute them to basically start showing some performance. So at some stage, the organization would take a initial check on the results that you are expected to do, and are you able to show that outcome in that trial period before the organization actually confirms you as an employee for that, or for that role, or for that position. So one of the things that we go through in terms of the journey is we go through an induction, and after the induction, a couple of weeks down the line, your probation period comes to an end, and if you perform well, you go through a bit of a review, and that review will help ensure that there are various aspects of the business you understand, and with that understanding of what you've developed, you are able to then perform in your role, and you're exhibiting the desired behavior and the contribution which is required for the organization to achieve the objectives in that role. Now, at some stage, if you've gone through the probation period and you've been confirmed, what happens next a couple of months down the line? Any ideas what happens a couple of months down the line? You've been confirmed, you've been given a confirmation that you are now an employee within the organization. So all the perks, incentives, everything start to apply, things like pension, holidays, and everything. So towards the end of the year, what will happen is that there will be an appraisal which will be done, and the appraisal tends to happen with the manager, the person you are reporting into, and at some stage, the HR will also get involved when the appraisal is happening to see if you have performed on the set targets or the objectives which have been given to you in your role and responsibility while working for the organization. So here, the organization towards the end, when you've spent a considerable amount of time within the organization, they expect that you understand the requirements of your role, you're able to perform in that role, you also understand the interests of the organization in that particular role and what you're expected to achieve. You at some point in time are so well aligned within the organization that you understand how to differentiate between the interests of the management, with differentiate between what the customers expect and your peers in terms of employees or your colleagues essentially, so that when you discuss, deal, or work with them on certain projects or areas, you're able to then establish what is called an effective working relationship, which allows you to work operationally and also effectively within the organization. So that is when the organization sees at the end of the year that this is an employee which is now very well settled within the organization, is able to contribute in areas when it is required, understands the priorities of the organization, and generally works well and has an effective relationship with all the elements within the organization that the person interacts with, whether it's outward facing customers, whether it's inward facing peers and colleagues, or when it is with management in the senior level. So when we look at strategy, that is where the HR role is to look at aligning from the time an individual is recruited into the organization to ensure with induction, with appraisal, with training and development. So a couple of months down the line, you might have some training and you might be put into a development program if they feel certain skills are lacking or certain areas in which the organization needs to develop skills. And towards the end, you have appraisal. So what the HR role is primarily to look at taking an individual who's new to the organization after the induction, after the recruitment process, through the induction process, through the process of, let's say training and development, and at some stage, appraisal. What they want to do is that their key role is to ensure that the person settles within the organization, contributes effectively in terms of achieving the objectives, and at some stage has developed those relationships to understand the nature and the purpose of the organization to help contribute and move it forward. And that is where the overall strategy comes into place. So they align business objectives of the organization, and slowly and gradually through the process of induction, training, and appraisals, make sure that the individual understands the overall purpose of the organization and then works in unison in order to, achieve those objectives. So here, in a nutshell, what I would do is I would kind of come to a conclusion that one of the things which HR does, and HR's whole responsibility is to ensure the alignment of the organizational strategy with the human resources strategy in the organization. So people should understand what the top management says and their, where the objectives are set. So one of the objectives is that we want to say, example, double the turnover of the organization this year in terms of sales turnover. So how will that be translated into individual roles and responsibilities? That part of the role is done by the HR to say that if the CEO is saying we were having say for example, 1 billion turnover in terms of the sales, but this year we want to look at increasing the turnover to say 1.5 billion. Now where the $500 million will come from? So the HR then understands the vision of the management, then translates that into some sort of a working plan. And that working plan is the HR strategy. That would mean that there will be an augmentation of human resource, there'll be equipment required, there'll be training required, there'll be some awards and performances, motivational things which will need to be put to push the existing employees to achieve more, targets. And in general, any step which needs to be taken in order to kind of make that plan viable would be termed as HR strategy. So their role is to align the business strategy, the goals and objectives the organization sets, break it down at the micro level, and align it with individual roles and responsibilities of the individual or staff employees working within the organization, so that they are able to contribute towards the main objective of what has been said by the management. So in this example, say doubling or increasing the turnover by 50% of the organization. So any questions on this so far?
No. So
Okay.
far, so good.
Okay. Let's look at a bit of
I have one question.
Go ahead, Osama.
So
Aslan, yeah.
basically, so far the idea of it is that HR should know the role of every job that is in an organization, to have that much knowledge that what everyone does and even how to train those people. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. So who actually the set of people who are within the organization which have a plan in place in terms of roles, responsibilities, job descriptions, that is generally a key area which the person in HR actually does. So they understand the overall strategy from the management, and then how that needs to be broken down into individual roles and responsibilities. When I say individual roles and responsibilities, I'll use a term called job description, and how this needs to become a part of that job description is going to be the part of HR or the role of HR within the organization.
So the role of an HR requires himself to be always learning.
That is correct. So when we look at some of the other learning outcomes, we will look at understanding some of the key functions of HR. And the key functions of HR would include things like planning, it will include training, it will include development, it will include talent management, it will look at performance management. There are loads of functions which are there in HR. But generally, when we look at from a perspective of understanding what is HR within a small or a medium-sized organization, we generally see that HR functions in appraisals. They look at, obviously, some part of it is to do with, operational policies, reviews, and some part of it is to look at payroll and grievances and other things. These are usual functions that we see of HR within the organization. But there is much, much more than what we generally see, and this is going to be seen in because of the relative to the size of the organization. So in some big organizations, HR department is looking after 10 to 12 different types of functions. We will go into that in a bit more detail, but at this stage, a short answer to your question would be that they are the people which oversee and deliver some of the key bits of essential services which are required for the employees to be able to function. So when we talked about induction, when we talked about probation, trial period, they are the ones which allow the employees to set within the organization, understand the procedures, the policies, and then provide the basic necessary things for the person to be able to function or start function within a role. So if you're a sales manager, just to give you a quick example here, and you are expected to take field calls. Now, if the job advert does not advertise, say, as one of the perks being a car given by the company, then at some stage the HR would also look at, if the company does not provide the car, then what are the reimbursements which would be done on a kilometer or a mileage basis to the employee if the employee uses his or her own car for making those sales, field calls. So that critical bit of looking at benchmarking, that what are the various tools required to effectively function in that role would be done by HR, because they would be looking at creating the job description, benchmarking it with what is present in the market with respect to competitors, or with respect to the requirements for that role, and that would be the services part of HR which they would do in order to ensure that they are able to recruit the right person for that role. So they do a lot of activity. They start from the basics of recruitment and selection, and it can be as complex as managing training and development, which we talk about, or talent management, globalization. There are loads of other things that we will discuss as we go along. So it's a very complex question, but the short answer is they are the key set of people which align the organizational strategy with the business strategy, and then basically break that down at a minute level so that employees can understand what is their role, what role they play in the contribution to achievement of that strategy, so that on a day-to-day basis, I would not understand how do we double the turnover of the organization. So for me, I understand this statement from the CEO, but how does it affect my role? How do I contribute in doubling that turnover? That bit in terms of what is minute detail is actually, nitty-gritty of it is actually explained by the HR by taking out, newsletter, policy manual, changes in the job description, your role, and the let's say the resources which they provide, augmented resources which they provide for you to be able to achieve your target. So that detailing is done by HR. So alignment of that strategy is basically detailing done to meet the individual job description for an individual, and that will be what is called the will be the core role of the HR within the organization.
Okay.
Any other questions at this stage? Right. So let's move on. So let's look at, with one or two slides, understanding, how this particular field of study has developed over the years. So when we look at, in general, say, this particular field, which is human resources management, we look at this particular slide would describe basically how the evolution has happened. So if I look at the second industrial revolution, which is from 1890s to the 1915, just before the First World War, we see that here the HR was there as a function, but generally was termed as a welfare officer within the organization. And here the person was interested in looking at, how much are you bringing in terms of your contribution to the organization. Now, when we look at post-World War One and the, say, for example, rebuilding, which was happening up until the Great Depression in the 1930s, we saw a change in this term of welfare officer to becoming a labor manager. That means our people started to work within factories, the outputs within factories started to increase. As modernization started to happen after World War and in the Great Depression, obviously, government became the main employer of people within most countries. So here the role changed or the focus changed into managing labor or basically managing human resources. So and the term came about was labor manager. So sometimes when you look at, even today, when we look at organizations like call centers in particular, you would generally come to hear of this term called bums on seats. So what we generally see is that how many agents do you have who are able to take that many number of calls, for, say, for a particular client, if you're running call center as a business, whether it's an inbound, outbound, it is more to do with the number of people that you have on the seats who are able to take incoming calls and make outgoing calls. So sometimes we do see this term, still coming in, wherein the HR manager is actually managing what is called bums on seats, or the number of people on these seats to be able to expand the operations of a call center. Now, in the 1940s to the early 1980s, what we see is the term called personnel management, which came into being. So when we talk about personnel management, it basically meant that there was a focus on managing the people in terms of ensuring that they are able to work correctly within the organization. When we look at, say, mass industrialization, which started to happen, a lot of workers were working within factories producing, various things. So here the focus was that there used to be a line manager, and there are in some cases, line managers, production managers today, and their idea was to continuously supervise people so that they do not make mistakes when they are on the production line. So the focus moved to managing personnel, and the idea here was that there was a focus on administratively managing the personnel working within a department. The main focus was that the idea was to try and reduce defects. The idea was to try and reduce, obviously, any wastage of material which could happen because the workers were not guided properly, or, for example, were not trained properly in terms of, being managed when they were working within shifts. Then in the early 80s to 90s, we look at the function of the department coming into shape, which is human resource management as a function took shape. There were lots of experiments which have been done over the years, in terms of the evolution of this particular function. So we start with Frederick Taylor, Meyer, and then there were experiments which were done, like the Hawthorne experiments, which were done in the States in the early 19th century, wherein one of the main aspects of doing was that they considered humans also, or people as also one of the resources, and there was the concept of hard and soft HRM which initially took shape. So we look at some of the models, but we generally see the evolution of HR happening, and when we talk about strategic HR, that is after the dot-com bubble boost in the early 2000s, when we see a lot of dot-com companies started to come about. That is where the nature of HR became strategic because of things like globalization, because you no longer had companies having operations within one particular city, geography, or country, but the global operations of the companies meant that the HR department had to deal with compliance, regulation, different international labor laws, and also in some cases, when the production was split across different factories and plants in different countries, the nature of managing those resources became a specialist function. And that is where we generally see the outcomings of what is called the strategic role of human resources management, which started to come about. So the approach, if I say, transformed from being reactive in the early, I would say, 19th century to becoming proactive when we talk about managing it as a strategic function. Here, the role was predominantly, essentially just focused on resources, managing them, recruiting them, and there were, obviously things like perks, incentives, and other things primarily wasn't there. But slowly and gradually, they started to creep in when the functions became specialized, and these specialized functions required, a specific manpower with a number of years of experience and skill set. Slowly and gradually, that moved into becoming proactive. The companies then started to look at, even poaching employees from other organization competitors to say, if you have that employee who performs well, understands, has the experience, if we get them over to our organization, that will help us. So slowly and gradually, a lot of transition is what we see happening in each individual phases when we go from, the early 19th century to now the 21st century. And there are shifts which are highlighted in this slide, and they talk about shifts from being reactive to proactive, from being a generic role in terms of managing resources to becoming specialized, and also looking at, let's say, multidisciplinary side of things which are required now within people when they work within organizations. And then one of the other things that we see when the role became strategic was that the focus of HR changed from just managing resources to proactively ensuring that they seek out resources or training and development within resources to ensure that the staff who works within a particular role maintains those cutting edge skills which are required to produce the output or achieve that particular responsibility or the goal set in the organization. Now, at this stage, what I will also want to do very briefly would be to look at understanding some of the key frameworks which have come about in terms of the HR models. Now, we are going to look at about 3 or 4 different models, and the idea is to understand how the evolution of these models have also happened, and that will show you the change in focus of HR and the role of HR, how it has changed over the years. Now, we look at 2 models in particular to understand the early 1950s, 60s, and the late 70s and 80s. So we look at the Harvard model and the matching model of HR. Now, matching model of HR is also called the Michigan model. So when we look at these 2 models, what we generally see in this particular model is that when Michael Beer and his colleagues actually worked on understanding the concept of how human resources and the function of human resources happens within the organization, they came about with 5 elements. One of the key elements that they looked at was what are the stakeholders within the organization, and what are the demands of these stakeholders with regards to human resources. So they created one particular box in which they put stakeholders' interest. So stakeholders, when we talk about of the organization, it could be management, employees, government, unions, external parties like suppliers. When I say government, because government generally sets the policies, the frameworks, the legislation. So they are an important stakeholder in terms of understanding when you start a business or produce a good or services to be sold, companies have to comply with that regulation and legislation in that particular country or in that location. So what they looked at was, one of the key sets was that there is a clear, establishment of stakeholders who are going to be the people who invest within the company, start a business, things like that. Then the second box that they created in terms of understanding how the model, how human resources would be looked at, say managing the human resources side of things, was they looked at what are the factors which affect the business. So what are the external factors which affect the business or an organization? And when we talk about the external factors, they looked at things like, what could be the management philosophy, what does the top management think, what are their priorities. They looked at, markets to understand say, for example, when I say market, is there an appetite for business? Is there an appetite for that type of product? What is the role of technology? How is the, laws and legislation within a particular geography? So those kind of things which could be external factors, they call them as situational factors. These situational factors could be a combination of, things like workforce characteristics. It could be a combination of, factors which are labor market related, business, conditions, and then in general market, they put them all into one particular box, and that is called situational factors. Now, what they looked at was that when you look at stakeholders' interest and how the external factors are affecting the business of the organization, these two, what they firmed up was that will shape up the HR requirements or policy of the organization. So what kind of employees would be recruited, what would be their roles and responsibilities, what kind of rewards would be offered, what in terms of motivational techniques would be put in place. So it could be incentive, rewards, bonuses, things like that. And what kind of work systems would be required in terms of running the HR as a department were actually coming about because of the stakeholders' interest and the factors which could affect the business. And they both together would then give rise to the HR policy of the organization. Now, the implementing of the HR policy was done on the basis of 4 C's. So here they considered human resources to have these 4 broad, things before anybody was even recruited into the organization. So they looked at human resources or people to have commitment, congruence, competence, and cost effectiveness. So if somebody was being recruited in the organization for a particular role, was that person able to bring that revenue or that turnover or, that particular desired outcome? And was it cost effective for the organization? So each of the C's was then looked at from a point of view of, checking with the person being recruited to ensure that they were as close as possible to having these 4 outcomes which were desired by the HR policy within the organization. And if they were able to meet these 4 commitments or were as close to meeting these 4 commitments, we would generally see that the organization would realize some of the benefits they had wanted to realize because of the recruitment of that resource, and they would be things which would then help the organization in a long term to achieve those goals and achieve those perspectives. So things like, if you were able to commit, if you're able to perform, if you're able to, bring a certain amount of skills to the role that you work in, then the organization would respond to you in the fact that you would be rewarded suitably. There'll be, training and development for you. But if that meant that you were not performing well and you were not committed to the organization, not achieving the goals, then you were shunted out or made redundant, and the organization would start the process again, going back to finding resources which would align very closely with the 4 C's. So this particular approach, in terms of the model, had some drawbacks. So here the main drawback was that this particular model actually looked at the individuals or maybe the employees from a perspective that they were one of the resources required to basically help the organization achieve the objectives, which could be any sort of objectives, and they were mainly focused on understanding that this particular model looked at employees as one of the resource to be able to, help achieve that objective. So they were not very aligned. This particular model, when it came out, was not very aligned to the fact that, let's say the well-being of the individual was looked at. If you were performing, you would get the benefits. If you're not performing, you would be ignored. So basically having a very hard approach to the human resources as a model in which you were considered one of the resource, and if you're bringing or doing value addition to the job or the role that you were working in, then you would be looked after well, you would be paid well. But if you were not performing, and if this was something which was not meeting the expectations of the organization, then in those cases the employee would generally be moved out or shunted from the organization. There were obviously this particular model, there were a lot of studies which basically looked into the fact that this particular model and approach was not very settling for all types of organizations. And in this case, sometimes when change was being implemented, the model proved to be inflexible, looking at different strategies, and obviously from an aspect of understanding that how if the company changed its direction, how the existing resources were then able to be retrained, developed to work in those roles and responsibilities. So this model was very inflexible, from that particular perspective. But nevertheless, it identified some of the key aspects of how an HR policy actually is framed within the organization. What are the objectives, and how the organization looks at implementing and creating a department within the organization. It provides some solid foundations for that. So when we look at this particular model is also sometimes termed as the HRM model, but focused on performance-related aspects within the organization. So if you're performing well, you're doing well, you're contributing towards the goal, the individual practices and the basic things that you get within the organization for meeting performance is actually rewarded, and this then looks at you favorably from an employer's perspective or from an employee's perspective. So here the performance is key, and that is why this is also sometimes termed as the performance model. Is that okay? There is some background document which I will provide along with these slides which are up on MOOEL, and the idea would be to just go through that to understand the reasons why the model might be adapted by all organizations when they manage human resources. Now, the second model that we look at is, sorry, any questions on this?
All good.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I said all good. All good.
Okay. Now, the second model that we look at is called the matching model. Now, this particular model, the work was done by a couple of, scientists on this particular model. But when they looked at, in general, coming up with a framework, what they came up with that there are 4 common processes within the organization. Now, after the selection of the individual has been done, or the human resource has been done, there is a particular focus on matching the individual's existing experience, skill set with the job or the nature of the job which is required to be done in the organization. And that allows the individual to, start performing from day one. So here, the matching model focuses on also what it basically looks at is that what is the best fit, of the individual's existing experience, skill set, with the roles and responsibilities within the organization. So here, what the model tries to do is find a fitment between the individual being recruited to the individual's existing experience and skill set, and sees what kind of performance the individual will actually provide in that role. So there are 4 key aspects of this particular model. And one of the aspects is that if you select the individual on the basis of the job description, the skill set required, then here the performance of the individual will be, as expected within that role. And then if the individual starts performing, there are rewards which are given, and the individual also gets to go into training and development, which would further enhance the performance of the individual, because what they've done is they've found a best fit or a person who is fit for that particular role, and that is where the main aspect of this model is. So this particular model basically focuses on finding, when you look at companies placing out a job advert for a particular role, what they do is they get a lot of CVs. When they look at doing the process of shortlisting and selection, they would sit down carefully and look through what are called keywords. So in the job description the HR manager creates, they would put across some keywords, which is what would be directly related to the role and responsibility for which they are recruiting. So if you look at sales, if you look at marketing, if you look at finance, there'll be some keywords which is what they are spotting in the CVs. Now, when these keywords are met, then the individuals are shortlisted on the basis of their CV. They go through a process of selection, and there the HR is primarily looking at finding the best fitment in terms of the skill set which they've got in the individual with the role within the organization. So in general, this particular model, when we look at, is also called the best fit model of HR. So in this case, over the years, a lot of organizations which have adopted this particular model, or the Michigan model as we also call it, the best fit model as we call it, their approach to human resource management in terms of recruitment selection requires the individual to have a very tight fit with the responsibilities that they are going to undertake in that role. So that's the second model, which we see as a bit of an evolution which has happened over the years when we look at organizations having this model, of recruitment and selection being implemented within or adopted within the organization. So when you look at call centers in general, there are lots of things which the HR managers or people who are in the recruitment side within that organization look at, and they tend to follow this best fit model or the matching model. They look at for keen characteristics like voice modulation. They look at how good you are with customers, how for example, let's say how good you are with stretching conversations or being able to make conversations. What is your personality? How pleasing you are, and have you had prior work of working within a call center or a customer services facing organization? So here the objective is they're trying to find the best fit before they recruit an employee or an individual within the organization, so that when the employee joins, it starts performing from day one. There are some basic, inductions and training and development which is done, but over a point in time, the employee would always generally perform because the recruitment has happened on the basis of, the best fitment. Now, the four aspects that we see on this model: look at selection, look at appraisal, look at reward management, and further development of the individuals to ensure that their skills remain, at par when they are delivering that in the, say for example, in their day-to-day role. So this is another adaptation of the, model, which is the Michigan model or the matching model or the best fit approach model as we call it. And here, the idea is the firm is always trying to, or the organization always is trying to find a tight fit with what is the requirement and what kind of individual they will get, in that role for that, Now, this also is a model which focuses on, what is called hard HRM. Now, in general, what we will look at is when we look at hard versus soft HRM, this is also a model which basically, or an approach which basically came up. And here the two different approaches, focused on, when we say hard model, it focuses on, making sure that there's a right fitment. Employees are treated as, one of the resource. So if you are fit for the role, you will be recruited. If you're fit for the role and you're performing well, get some bonuses, incentives, the organization will look after you. But if it's not, and the other way, the soft approach, then what will happen is the organization treats you as a resource, but there are lots of other embodiments which the organization puts in place to ensure and understand the nature that why you are not performing, or does it is it the case that in some cases it basically looks at treating employees as one of the most important assets. So in hard HRM, you are one of the assets within the organization, one of the resource within the organization. And literally, when I look at differentiating between the two, the soft approach would be looking at understanding that how you are treated, are you getting the adequate working conditions, do you have adequate resources to be able to perform, and the soft aspect, which is the aspect of understanding, and treating employees, as one of the key resource is looked into, and that is where the management actually focuses on long term, and they say, okay, there could be reasons that you are not doing well because of say personal problems, and in those cases the pastoral side of support within the organization is also offered, and that is why this approach tends to be adopted by a lot of organizations, rather than saying, okay, if the individual is not working, let's take him out, get another one, or get somebody else in that role. So when we look at the approach, we look at employees being treated as an individual, not as one of the resource or machines within the organization that, okay, if the resource is not there, the work would stop. Or in this case, the hard approach would be, we'll get somebody else to do the job. So sometimes this differentiation also is seen in the reason where the models and the frameworks have evolved over the years within the organization. Now, very briefly, there are two other models that we look at. One is David Guest's model. Now, this particular model focused on dividing the HR roles into 4 different, processes within the organization. And this is what we get to see in terms of competency-based model in the early 2000s when the research was done, and David Ulrich and, some of his colleagues basically came up with the idea that the HR function is a close-knit, role wherein it needs to be effectively divided into 4 different areas. So there are day-to-day operational jobs, and there are strategic nature of the jobs for which, you need to look at planning for long term. So they built 4 aspects or created 4 pillars, and these 4 pillars were processes and people, future and day-to-day operations. And that is where they broke the model down into understanding that if the business strategy is to look at resources from a point of view of performance, from a point of view of long-term development, then the HR strategy also has to be married with the business strategy, and that is where they need to then look at ensuring that there is a very clear and distinction in terms of what the HR practices are. The HR then informs the employees of these practices and what is expected, and then provides all the resources, tools, or maybe the basic embodiments which are required for you to function effectively within your role. And the HR then works also on the motivational side to ensure that there is the 4 C's that we've looked at: competence, commitment, congruence. Those are also built into the HR practices and policies to ensure that if there is something missing, then the HR steps in and provides that. If the training is required, it is provided, because they want to see that they want to make sure that the resources have the required training and develop the skill set to be able to perform in that particular function. And this particular model is generally seen in large organizations, because there the HR function is very well developed. It can be broken down into different areas, or let's say different areas of approach, and that is where it allows different functions of HR to be managed by different people, so that at some stage there is an effective management of the whole function of human resources management within the department itself. And that is where the functions are compartmentalized into these different segments. So when I talk about, administrative role of HR, we look at things like payroll, drawing up of contracts, appraisals. That would be the administrative function of HR as per, David Ulrich. Now, when we talk about strategic nature would look at talent management. That means people who are performing well they need to be focused on, they need to be trained, they need to be given ideal opportunities within the organization. Otherwise, the individual end up leaving the organization. So the growth is commensurate to managing the talent and the expectation of the individual, so that they remain loyal to the organization and they are able to grow within the organization. Then they look at the other side of the function, which is to look at creating what are called the employee champions. That means reward and performance management is openly acknowledged within the organization. So if you're performing well, you get a reward. Employee of the month, sometimes you see, or employee of the year. The HR also has strategies in place wherein they say 3 years of service, you get a reward, 5 years of service, you get a reward. 10 years of service, you get a reward. So lots of different things which are then looking at promoting some of the best practices and, highlighting them throughout the organization is one of the aspects of the HR. So things like when you see in organizations like newsletters, monthly newsletters being done up by HR, you see Employee of the Month, you see, say, for example, competitions and activities being done, and that is to engage employees to get feedback from the employees who work within the organization to ensure that they are cared for and they are being developed continuously and rewarded commensurate to the role that they play or the goals they help achieve the organization. And then they also look at change agent. Now, when I say the change agent aspect of it is that you see that in some cases, if the organizational strategy takes a change, the HR needs to become, say, for example, a key enabler to be able to making sure that the employees embrace that change. So in some cases, you see HR also plays a role to introduce change within the organization. And that change could be done in different formats. A simple example that I would give here is we look at most organizations because of COVID-19, for example, across the globe today, most of the employees were, because of the lockdowns and other things, most of the organizations shut down in terms of work. So employees were not allowed to go or were not allowed to go to the offices, or obviously there was a lockdown implemented in most locations, cities, countries. Now, in this case, the change which has to be implemented within the organization in terms of ensuring that workers are able to work remotely. In some cases, some of the key functions of the organizations continue to be running, is the change management which HR has put into place, or most of the HR departments actually went into overdrive. And when you look at some of the big organizations like Google announcing that they are giving away $1,000 to every individual within the organization so that they can buy equipment or desk or furniture and other bits so that employees could work effectively from home. Now, Google as a company is one of the companies which has also announced that the employees do not need to come back to office or work within the office till next year, January. So what they've done is HR, and some aspects in discussions with the management, has decided that this change needs to be embraced. There'll be more of remote working, and in order to keep the operations going, we'll have to provide that flexibility. So one of the key aspects of how this has been rolled out through the the involvement of HR department, and they have acted as a change agent in this case to ensure that the employees are actually kept well informed. And in some cases, organizations like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, they have then allowed employees to flexibly work from home. And in order to ensure that they have all the reasonable tools and, say, for example, things to work from home, in some cases, organizations have also given out, additional funds or, additional remuneration to help ensure that the employees are able to buy the relevant things and then look at, working for the organization. So this particular model, David Yates model, is essentially a model which creates a link between how HR best manages resources to create and influence performance for the organization. So the focus is on achievement of the goal. And that is where, if you see, Google has done exactly what they need to do is they need to make sure that the employees work, they're able to continue to provide services. And what is done in the short term is announced that £1,000 or $1,000 essentially as an additional payout. And in addition to that, saying you can work from home, no need to come to offices till January. And in order to work from home, if you need to set this up in terms of your working environment, here we go, that's an additional money being given. And that is being done as a change which is being made effective by HR. Is that okay? Now, the last model that we want to look at is the Bath model, wherein again it focuses on people and performance. Now, this is a particular research which was done by Professor John Purcell of Bath University in the UK. And in the early 2003s, along with CIPD, which is an institute for professional development, they undertook a research or a study to look at how 12 companies in general. They looked at researching 12 companies to see what is the link between reputation of the company over a period of 3 years and how the employees actually influence the HR practices, culture, and in general the reputation of that company. And they came out with an empirical study which was done. And in this study, basically what they looked at was that the reputation of the company and how happy the employees were and what kind of a culture in the company promoted performance was actually based on the attitude and commitments of the individual working within the organization. So here they were able to draw a direct link between the commitment, loyalty, and attitude of the individual towards the organization and the performance of the individual, because the organization was committed to motivating the individual, providing all the resources, tools, and technique required, which allowed the employees to perform to their maximum, and in effect they were able to get the loyalty, commitment, and a very development of positive attitude, which always meant that the organization was performing and achieving the objectives which are set. So this model is a performance model which now is incorporated into companies, because it looks at all aspects of human resources. It looks at the aspects of development, the motivational side of things, how employees participate, their well-being, overall, the work-life balance. So it brought in a number of 13 factors, which were taken into account to ensure that, employees felt at home. And that is what led to the individuals performing to their maximum capacity, and in turn led the organization to achieve the objectives year on year, wherein, when this study was done in 12 of the reputed organizations within, say, for example, in the world. And this has now got adopted as a model which most companies look at following. So when we see the functions of HR, what we do see: training and development, recruitment and selection, pay satisfaction. A lot of companies today also do benchmarking of pay. When they look at, say, coming out with a job description or a new role requirement, they will actually look at benchmarking that what does this role actually pay when they look at competitors in the market. The role also looks at today from a human resources perspective, how much is too much in terms of responsibility, and will the role help the individual manage work life with, personal life in terms of a balance. They also look at responsibilities in the organization in terms of the role, wherein they look at the role should also be challenging to the individual. Whether the individual works within teams, how involved the individual is, what role does communication play? Open communication today plays a very important role. What are the motivation and incentives which are required to be put in that role? The skills and abilities required, and where are the opportunities for the employee to grow? So if you recruit a manager today and you recruit somebody who has high experience, they might come in to the role because the pay is a slightly higher pay, maybe the organization is bigger, the brand name is good, or they want to add and work the experience of that company in their CV. They might come on and stay within the company for a year, 2 years, but that might leave. And that would have a detrimental effect in terms of the organization losing an individual on which they have spent a lot of time, effort, and money over the years. So in this case, what will the employee look at after they start performing in this role? How will the progression be mapped? What are the opportunities of growth are also looked at in this particular model. So this looks at, from a holistic approach, how best to look at recruiting the individuals, why the individuals choose a particular organization, on all the aspects which are required to manage that individual's expectation, and how this is directly related to these organizations which were in the study, in the research study, that why they were performing year on year, why the employees were happy within the organization. And this model was, after that research, able to establish that if the organization takes all these factors into view while they look at providing these to the employees at the time of selection, recruitment, or when they are working within the organization, this creates a direct connection with the shows a direct connection with the loyalty, the attitude, and the motivation and commitment which the employees has towards working within the organization. And this as a model is now got adapted in most of the organizations globally. So this is the modern adaptation of the HR model, or the framework which most departments actually use when they look at putting the HR strategy in place. Is that okay? Yeah, is that all okay so far?
Yes.
So in terms of these 5 different models, is there anything that, for instance, if there is someone who's working in human resource and they have to pick a certain strategy out of these to pick, have the previous one gone obsolete now and they have to look at the latest one, or?
No, that is not the case. What tends to happen is when you look at all these models are all relevant today for different organizations. So depending on the size, the say for example the area of operation, sometimes you would see some models being implemented within the organization in order to develop an HR framework. So you would see some reminiscence of different models when you see different types of organizations, different organizations in different sectors, and also related to the size in terms of the business of the organization. So generally speaking, there is no set specific model that might apply to all organizations of any size or any sector. But in this case, depending on the vision and mission and how the HR department actually shapes up within the organization, you would generally see one of these models being enacted into or taken into incorporation while forming the HR practices or policies within the organization. We generally see now from a modern context, if you look at production facilities, you look at manufacturing facilities, generally what tends to happen is the best fit model is normally put into operation. Because if you have a car manufacturing company like Nissan, Honda, BMW, Toyota, whatever it is, they would need individuals with a specific fit in terms of the role before they employ them. So here they try and mostly, when they look at recruiting people for the production floor, they try and employ the matching model or the best fit model. But when we look at some organizations which are basically well established, they have global operations or multi-location operations, you would generally see either a David Guest model or the people in performance model or the Bath model being put into practice, because the processes are well set, and in order for the value addition to happen from the HR side to maintain and effectively keep individuals within the organization, the scale of the organization will warrant a larger department, and larger department would mean that these kind of functions would then be a part and parcel of the organization. So there is no one model which fits all organizations. Depending on the operations, the size of the organization, the sector in which they operate, you would generally see different models being adapted and different models being used to create the HR practices within that organization.
Okay, so can it be that 2 models be used or adopted for recruitment for an organization? I mean, if there's not one strategy, can there be 2 strategies?
There can be 2 strategies, yes. So in this case, you could look at, say, for example, if I look at Nestle as an organization or Unilever as an organization which has operations in 50 countries, and if they decide to look at expanding into another country, with a they start with a very small size operation. And in this case, when they start recruiting people and put some HR practices in place, they might implement a different model to begin with. But over a point in time, they might just have a strategy to, then implement a model which, or practice, include the practices which are done at a global level, since the operation of the company might become sizable in 5, 10, 15 years. So they could implement a moving strategy wherein some of the practices are adopted and adapted depending on how the business is happening in that country. So when you look at Coke and Pepsi as organizations, they started off with the best fitment model, but over the years, these organizations have become that big that they, in order to keep and manage people within the organization and not keep looking at the process of recruitment and selection again, because when we look at costs, companies definitely spend a lot of cost in terms of advertisements, recruitment as a process, selection as a process, training and development as a process within the organization. So at some stage, when the organizational operations become big and they standardize these operations across, all, all locations within the company, they tend to at some stage then start following either the BART model or the David Guest model, because they look at a holistic approach rather than a specific approach which might be relevant when the operations of the company are small or they are a startup organization in that location. So this is an evolving strategy. You cannot have one strategy, as you've asked as a question, is a good question, because things change. So COVID-19, for example, has changed the HR strategy or has forced the companies to think on what would be their HR strategy going forward, because we are still living with COVID-19. There is no resolve, no vaccine, no particular solution available at this moment. And you will continue to see a lot of organizations would encourage working from home, remote working, or working from home as a model would come up, and that would involve HR to rethink and then reapply some of these models to ensure how can they keep employees motivated at home, how can they make the employees productive at home, because companies are paying the usual salaries. They're not saying that you're going to be looking at reduced salaries. So how does HR then look at which model is to be implemented? And that is obviously an ongoing thing. So the strategies keep evolving. Mm-hmm. There is no best fitment of this model that suits all the organizations. They have to be adapted to suit the organization, the nature of their business of the organization, and depending on how many employees work within the organization. So Google might look at everything, and they might implement training, development, pay satisfaction, why they've given out $1,000, but not all companies would have the capability to pay the employees to buy a desk or a new PC or invest in broadband to ensure that they can work from home. So some of these have to be adapted, and they are going to be adapted on the basis of the type of the organization, the size of the organization, the products and services they provide. In some cases, if you look at manufacturing companies, might not be able to do anything because the factories are closed and they require resource to work within the factory to produce, an output like a car. But in the case of Google, software organizations, which can work remotely, still produce some sort of a software code or work on certain functions, they would continue. But some of the manufacturing organizations might not be able to adapt, or they are thinking hard to adapt by putting a model in place wherein they would run shifts or things like that. So no one particular model fits an organization, and it has to be looked at from a point of view of how the overall situation of the company is, the situation externally which is impacting the company, and then these shape up the HR practices which the organization generally would have for a number of years going forward. Now, so this is where you see the evolution of HR. So when we look at the earlier, slide, just very briefly, this is what we see from a bit of a, perspective of how HR has come about. But if we see the modern version of HR and what is the nature of HR function now, so the functions have transformed from being transactional to transformational. This also has a bit of a bearing when we read the unit of strategic leadership. We talk about 21st century leadership. We'll also talk about models like transformation and transactional leadership. And the reason why this has come about, because there's a lot of work which is being done by different, people in this area. So they have also classified this from a point of view of how the role of HR is transforming from being transactional, generating pay slips, appraisals, policies, procedures, dealing with this on a reactive basis, to how the work has become transformational. And one example that you can see how this work is transformational is when you see mergers and acquisitions happening. So Vodafone acquires another organization. So in the UK, if you look at a big transformational, merger which has happened, is Sainsbury's has acquired Argos. You look at BT has acquired EE, which is, a mobile telephone company. And what they've done is this had meant that 240,000, 50,000 employees, need to be now incorporated into a bigger organization. So there are lots of overlapping functions. There are lots of employees which will have overlapping responsibilities, and that is where the HR department will go into a transformational work to shortlist and keep employees, which are relevant for that role. There is no duplicacy happening in that role. And this is in general a bigger example, just to look at how the role of HR becomes transformational. Look at keeping the right employees at the right pay and salary, which are going to be fit for the organization, can understand the culture, can work and, get into the organizational culture and develop effective relationships to, continue work forward. And the ones which they feel are not going to be meeting that criteria would be then obviously made redundant. So when you look at the work here, it is transformational. So there are now changes which have happened in the nature of HR, how the function works within the organization is what we get to see in terms of the evolutionary aspect of it, and that would be, the yeah.
Okay, I'll tell him to come out.
Right. So this way would be, looking at just as a different perspective. Now, what I want to do very briefly is to look at, after covering the learning outcome 1 theoretically, what we also want to be able to do is we want to be able to look at some of the assessment criteria in terms of addressing the assessment criteria in terms of the tasks that you are going to see in the assignment. So one of the first assessment criteria talks about, how do you justify the importance of strategic resource management in an organization. So I've put together some slides which primarily cover the individual, assessment criteria for you to understand. Now, yeah, go ahead. Any questions so far? Any questions? Sorry, somebody asking me a question. All right. So basically, in order to, now, let's say, effectively understand what is required from what we've covered theoretically to now look at doing the tasks which are going to be given in the assignment, what I've done is I've created a few slides which basically talk about and address some of these assessment criteria. So the first one talks about the importance of HRM in an organization. So can we just quickly look at summarizing what is the importance of HRM within the organization? Any thoughts of what we've discussed so far? So importance of HR within the organization.
Hello.
Hi. Right, I've got somebody, Shukran, somebody speaking in the background. No worries. Now, basically here, when we look at the importance of HRM, one of the key things which I covered was that one of the very fundamental work of HR is that they align the business strategy of the organization with the day-to-day running operational roles and responsibilities of the individual within the organization. So the HR role is very fundamental to linking resources and goals within the organization to ensure that the organization achieves the objective. That is the first part. Second part that we will look at is the HR is responsible for ensuring that they have the adequate resources and the resources which are there within the organization have the adequate skill set, training, and the aspect of working competitively within that role or in the role that you're working. The third part that we would look at in terms of the importance of HR would be to understand and align people's thinking with the organizational thinking. So if I say that as a CEO within the organization, if I say that we're looking at doubling the turnover of the organization, then the understanding of the individuals who work within that organization in different departments need to be the same, that when they need to sing from the same, songbook, that means they need to clearly understand how would that, effectively be transferred into some sort of a working plan. And that working plan or that bit of, understanding is developed by HR from a point of their planning, which they do with resources. And last but not the least, when we look at, some of the other aspects of organization, because of globalization, organizations having operations in different geographies, what we generally get to see is that the HR is also fundamentally responsible for ensuring that if there is a major change coming within the organization, when we talked about the David Guest model, we looked at the 4 different aspects. So they look at look at performance management, they look at change management, they also look at aspect of they also look at the aspect of, say, for example, ensuring that there is right fitment of resources with the people and the resources required in the organization. There is technology, in some cases, if it brings across a change, is implemented within the organization. So they are also then looking at compliance with legislation in the market. And one of the things which I would put here as an example would be that when the government changes laws, so in the UK, for example, the minimum wage was changed in the last parliament, when the minimum wages were raised, from, say, certain level to a certain level. Now that meant that the HR department went into all the departments, wherever you have the function of HR, they went into a bit of an overdrive to ensure that this particular change is then implemented in the next salary or the payroll which is processed by the department. So when we look at their role is let's say, I'll use the word, their role encompasses a lot of different functions that they have to look at, and the functions relate to maybe the international side of operations of the organization, the legislation of the introduced by the government. They look at aligning the vision of the management to the planning side of documents within the organization. They will also look at ensuring that performance appraisals, recruitment, selection, training, development as key functions which are required are also happening within the organization over a point in time. So when we understand the importance of HR, we see the importance of HR being quite strategic, because at every step of the way, you will see the involvement of human resources department, being critical for the achievement of, certain objectives within the organization. Is that okay? So let's look at, just with a few slides, the assessment criteria 1.2, which talks about what is the role and purpose of strategic HRM. So here, what we need to be able to do is basically talk about some of the activities which HR does on a day-to-day basis within the organization. So here we are looking at talking about the HR planning side of activities, which basically include things like recruitment, selection, training and development. We talk about performance appraisal, talent management. Those are the key bits that you have to talk about in this particular criteria, wherein you emphasize and show the role, what is the role of an HR manager, and what is their purpose in helping the management of those activities within the organization. So here we are going to be talking about the development of HR and HR responsibilities that you have to elaborate for this particular task. And let's look at that with a bit of an example. Now, I've taken an example of Tesco, and in this case, as a supermarket, if you see, it employs over 250,000 employees. They're a global organization. They have operation in about 14 countries. They obviously withdrew from Americas because of loss-making operations in the last few years. But generally speaking, if you look at a large organization like Tesco, it is not difficult to visualize what are the key functions of the HR department. So when I look at one of the key functions within an organization like Tesco, one of the things that stands out is welfare management. When one of the functions which looks at, emoluments, performance, incentive, rewards when things are done well. And, in order for the employees to work and feel that they work for a reputable company or, an organization as a global retailer in the world, they feel pride, and that is installed or instilled by the HR department. So welfare management, looking at, ensuring that employees are participative and also are engaged within the activities, and looking at delivering in terms of their role on a competitive basis, is all which the HR department does. And some of this, how would this be done? So if I take a very specific example of a superstore which Tesco runs, which has maybe 200, 300 employees, there's a general manager, there's a director of operation, there's an HR manager in that, because there's a lot of employee turnover which tends to happen within the stores. So people end up leaving the jobs, and there's a continuous process of recruitment and selection which happens. So from the head office, most of these policies, in terms of how the recruitment needs to be done, where you advertise the job, what is the payroll, what is the kind of other incentives or perks that the employees would get in that particular role, will be all clearly well defined within the job description, which is available with the local store manager. Now, in order to ensure that the store is able to achieve and deliver on the targets in terms of turnover and the objective set, the store would need to have a minimum number of people working within the organization. And in order to do that, within the stores itself, the large stores which have 200, 250 employees, there's an HR manager or a HR person who basically works within that store to manage the welfare side, recruitment side, selection side of the activities for that store, because there's a continuous churn which tends to happen in the store in terms of employees. So in order to retain the employees, sometimes you would see the store manager would announce incentives, things like there's a lot of pilferage which happens from retail stores in terms of pickups and waste and customers theft, which generally happens when I use the word pilferage. So a lot of general managers in that store, the HR managers in that store have a policy in place which is like a rewarding policy to say that if we spot anything which is happening and if we report it and if we minimize the loss of inventory to say 0.1% or 0.2% of the year, then generally there is a reward which is given to the employee or the department which helps restrict or reduce that pilferage or theft within the store. Because there are a lot of pickings which happen and there is a loss of stock, which means essentially loss of money for that store when we look at the yearly operations. So some of the strategic approaches which managers employ to keep the employees motivated by introducing these short goals or rewards, essentially keep the employees within say motivated within the organization. So it could be that they might announce an award for this week saying that the employee who gets the maximum sale would get an additional £50 voucher, or in some cases they say you get an additional day off in your rota. So those are kind of incentive plans which the managers within the store, the director of operations within the store actually have the capacity to be able to run without taking permissions or requisitions from the head office, because this will allow them to run the store operations more effectively. And taking an example of Tesco, from a store perspective, allows us to clearly understand what is the role of HR, why the HR manager will introduce these small incentives or schemes, is to ensure that he or she actually keeps the employees motivated within the organization in order to make them perform to their best possible level. Now, the last assessment criteria focuses on basically understanding how HR works with other departments. So when we look at other departments, what do you mean by, can you name a few other departments? Any other department that you know that generally would be there in organizations? So what do you mean by other departments?
Like a marketing department, sales department.
That's correct. So when we look at
audit department.
Absolutely. So when we look at this particular assessment criteria, what it is asking you to do is basically evaluate how HR works in relation to other departments. It could be finance, marketing, production, sales, engineering, customer services, things like that. Now, when we need to relate the functions of HR to other departments, we need to be able to understand what are the functions which the HR actually does. So on this slide, what I've done is I've written some of the functions which HR actually does. So things like recruitment selection, designing a job description, looking at, change management, looking at doing performance reviews. In some cases, there are grievances which need to be looked at, complaints which need to be managed from employees. So they look after what is called the unions or employee relations. They also look at compensation, reward, benefit management, training, development. These are functions of HR. Now, how would these relate to some of the other areas is what we need to look at in this task. So if we take an example of a factor like globalization. So if you imagine a company you work within, and in that company, the company is looking at now expanding operations to say Turkey. From UK, it is going to open operations in Turkey or in the Middle East. Now, one of the things why this decision would be taken is the management is looking at expansion. So when expansion happens, if we look at, in this case, the marketing department or the sales department, which is looking at doing the expansion, would actually come and then sit with HR or the concerned person in the HR and say, okay, we need to look at recruiting 10 people in that geography. So they will start working together to look at creating a job description. The HR would then agree on the package, the job responsibilities, and once the job description is finalized, the marketing or the sales side would sign it off and then hand it over to HR. The HR would then go and start looking at, putting this plan into action. So they will. So as an HR manager, if I put on that hat, what I would start to do is look at contacting some of the recruitment companies in that area or agencies which would, help provide some CVs. You look at doing an advert in the paper, and the HR department then gets into a bit of an overdrive. So here is what we see, the collaboration of how HR is working with business development or marketing as a department to ensure that the recruitment happens in a set possible time which has been set. And that tends to happen in terms of closely working with some of the other departments in that country. So here, in short, what we'll have to look at is maybe pick up a parameter which would be allowing you to explain it with an example of how HR will work with other departments. So HR could also then work with the finance department to seek an approval on the salary package or the expenses which are going to be incurred when they look at recruiting those 10 people or resources within a particular geography. So cost of advert, setting up an office, looking at a recruitment agency, looking at salary packages and things like that. There would be a budgeting or a cost approval which the HR would take from the finance side to say, okay, this is signed off as an additional cost for HR for this year. And that also shows a closer working with some of the other departments when they start to look at, putting this plan into action of recruiting employees for a new setup which the company is doing in a different location. So here the idea is to primarily look at showing how the functions of HR, what are the functions of HR? And then after briefly talking about this, what you're looking at doing is explaining how they would work in tandem with some of the other departments within the organization to achieve those objectives. So in this case, recruitment as an objective. And in this case, the HR would work with finance, would work with the concerned department for which the recruitment is being done. They might also work with the administrative department because a new office or a working office needs to be put into place. So the responsibilities in terms of coordination and approvals and sanctions would need to be taken, and they would then show a bit of working within different departments. Is that okay?
Yes, I have a question. Well,
Go ahead.
it's not a question, but it's just that the SHRM right now is going to be working with different departments, as you said, and the role in most of the department, the role is about the same. Like recruiting, they're going to recruit for every department, right? And
Yes.
then they're going to pay every department as well. So some specifications are same for all departments, regardless of the department, correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
See, every department has, so when I look at a small company, maybe the director of the company itself would be making a decision in terms of recruiting somebody, deciding the pay package, and also may act as a HR person in that capacity because he's the final decision maker. But in some cases, when you look at a larger setup or a small, medium setup, you would generally see that there are distinct functions within the organization, and there are different areas in which different people will be required to be able to do that job. So if a chief executive is to say that I'm looking at hiring somebody as a business development manager in a particular location, he might have a discussion with the HR person, give him the instruction, and on the basis of that instruction, the HR person will then come up with a job description, a plan to look at recruitment, and at some stage they will look at doing some budgeting, and then he might go back to this chief executive again to say, this is what it is looking like. It will take 4 to 6 weeks. These are the agencies I would contact, and a bit of an approval and preparatory approval will have to be taken.
So basically, going back to the 4 C's. Going back to the 4 C's, they're going to look at the 4 C's. If they're competent, cost effective, and all these things.
Yes. So in this case, the HR person would look at whether the requirement is very specific, and depending on how the policies of recruitment are within the organization, some of these things are already set. They might need to be adapted if it is for a different location, geography wherein the company has not worked before. So here the idea is to primarily talk with an example of how an HR person would actually work with other departments to be able to look at sometimes enabling certain things. So recruitment is a core function of HR, but where does the recruitment requirement originate from? So in this case, it originates from the business development team or the direction by the board. But the nitty-gritty of the planning in terms of, because it's recruitment, is done by HR. There's a lot of coordination with other departments in terms of budgeting, finance, and maybe the job descriptions finally being approved to recruit the right person. And that is where they need to work in correlation with some of the other colleagues working within other roles, and then look at showing that basically bringing out how they are working with other departments.
Okay, perfect.
So their function is more of collaboration, their function is more of communication, their function is more of, in some cases, if it's directly recruitment, then it is more of, primary function of doing the job rather than depending on the other departments to do it. But in some cases, if it's training and development, that would mean that the resources are already there and the infrastructure is already there, but the manager, because they are introducing a new product, the HR would be given a responsibility to say that can we look at training the employees on a new product. An example here that I would give is, if an organization is moving from Windows 7 to Windows 10, there would be a lot of training which will be required, but the decision in terms of IT has already been done, budgeting has already been done, but the HR then needs to work in close relation with IT to say how many employees, what PCs, what is the age set, where are the responsibilities first. So first people to get the training might be people who are outward facing with the organization. So they work here, the work of HR department to help, let's say, move that transition of moving the company from Windows 7 to Windows 10, which could be around 2,000 PCs or 200 PCs with 200 users, would start with the IT department and coming up with a plan, and at some stage looking at the discussions with other department heads to see which are the key set of people which need training first, which need to be enabled first, and that is where the closer working of the HR department starts to happen, so that it is working to ensure that the transition happens smoothly.
Okay.
Right. So let's look at any other questions for today's discussion that we've had on Learning Outcome 1. So anything at your end, David?
I'm okay.
Okay, you're okay. Pauline, at your end?
I'm okay, thank you.
Shukran,
I'm okay,
at your
thanks.
end? Okay, that's great. Shukran, at your end? Okay, that's fine. And what about Arslan at your end?
So it's quite overwhelming, this whole information that the HR manager requires to have and also submit in a company.
Yes.
But I suppose that there is a company in which there is a human resource department itself, and there are people working in the human resource department.
Yes.
Who is going to look at their capabilities and if they are doing their job right and their incentives?
Actually, I was coming on the same thing. I was coming on the same question that he asked, that what if an HR is outsourced? I mean, there's an internal HR and then there's an outsourced HR. Who are going to be handling the outsourced HR and who's going to be looking over the HR, the internal HR? So basically, it was about the same question as Arslan said here. Who's going to be handling them?
So essentially, in this case, when you look at, when most organizations do come to a stage wherein they are looking at outsourcing certain functions of HR. So when you look at payroll, for example, when you look at training and development side of things, what most companies do is they set up a portal and they then release trainings to different employees from time to time, and they have to complete those trainings. But in some cases, if cost becomes an issue, technology becomes an issue, you would generally see these kind of decisions being done in large organizations wherein, they would outsource some side of the operational side of things of HR to different companies. So when we look at, say, one such example of training and development, now this is a big area in most established businesses and organizations. So what we do get to see is, in order to, and this is an area which is quite resource intensive, and also when I say resource, both in terms of IT resources, but also in terms of financial side of things. So when the outsourcing of this happens to a company, there are service level agreements which are set and responsibilities are clearly divided. So in this case, the core ownership is still with the company which is actually outsourcing that function. So somebody within the company, within the HR department, maybe the chief strategy officer or the chief HR officer, somebody who's senior enough would be responsible solely for that strategy. So at some stage, that person will have the requisite experience, the skill set, and also that person will be answerable to the board. So when you see people in this senior management, they have generally been rotated in the organization and seem to have lots of number of years of experience having worked within various departments. So sometimes you see the CEO of the organization or the chief operating officer has worked within manufacturing, finance, marketing, sales, engineering, and then slowly and gradually the person with the experience has moved up to that role. So that person would be responsible for doing the review of the HR side of things. And then when we look at outsourcing side of things, when it happens, who looks after the responsibility? That is by the HR itself, somebody senior enough within the HR department or the person responsible for that in terms of ownership would be responsible for drawing that up. And there are clear service level agreements which are drawn up before this kind of a outsourcing begins to happen. And generally it is seen in large organizations. So wherein there are hundreds and hundreds of employees spread across locations, different offices, and in order to minimize cost, sometimes having an HR person on roll and having a department on roll is seen as a cost center, and that is where the organization would, at some stage at the senior management level, would take a decision to say, can we look at outsourcing the basic activities? And a simple example that I would give you, which you can relate, would be that nowadays, you see the recruitment agencies play a very important role. So the HR does not look at putting the job adverts into the various, and what they do is they want to shortcut the time and also the resource and effort being put to recruit somebody directly. And that is where they go to a recruitment agency to say, we have a requirement for this, these many candidates, this is the role, this is the description, this is the pay package, can you send us some CVs? And they prefer to pay that agency because they're looking at shortcutting time or, essentially not going through that rigmarole of, things from nitty-gritty to be able to, recruit that person in that position. So this happens quite a lot, and the basics of which we see sometimes within large companies wherein they have retained recruitment agencies. So the basic role is they keep sending CVs, they keep shortlisting. That process of initial shortlisting selection happens at the agency end, and then the final candidates are only seen by the people in HR or people within the company when they do recruitment and selection. So this has become a part and parcel, and what you've asked is absolutely correct, and it is something which has become a part and parcel in small to, when I say small, organizations which have 250 employees or a turnover of more than 6.5 million in the UK, up to about 250 million when we look at, and this is generally a considered practice, HR best practice within organizations to have some retained agencies to do the initial process of recruitment and selection. Is that okay?
Okay.
All okay.
Good stuff. I know this was the first session, so we had lots to cover, a bit of a background, and everything. So it has been a double session today. So I hope, with a bit of more understanding, we will try and squeeze the sessions down to about an hour. But because this is an interesting area and an area which is ever evolving, I think there are lots of discussions that we can do. Just after the session, when you see MOOEL in a couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is have one document which is primarily the history of the evolution of HR as a function, about 3 or 4 pages, which is what you will see on MOOEL, would be a good read. And then apart from that, 1 or 2 handouts, which are going to be 2 or 3 page handouts, specifically on the HR framework models. The Harvard, the Michigan, the Best Fit model, and the Bath model is what I'm going to put up for some additional reading. So if you understand these frameworks from what I've explained and read the handouts, which are 2-3 pages each, they will help crystallize your understanding on these basic frameworks which are utilized within organization to develop HR policies and practices. And I'll catch up with you in the meanwhile next week. Any questions that you can think of, please feel free to drop them over at Learnerwork, and I'll probably respond them to pretty quickly. Is that okay? Good stuff.
Perfect.
Thank
That's
you.
great.
And catch you later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.